Ellen Wright me estuvo contando que su primer trabajo que hizo relacionado con la genómica fue en 1978, o sea, 20 años, 18 o 19 años antes que yo. Así que realmente la pionera es Ellen Wright. Voy a hacer una presentación de ella. Ella es médico y además es abogada. ¿Quién mejor hablarnos de estos temas con esa doble formación? Doctora en Derecho. Es directora de pediatría, profesora titular de Derecho y profesora titular de Políticas de Salud en la Vanderbilt University en Estados Unidos. Ha estudiado y escrito por muchos años acerca de las implicaciones éticas, legales y sociales de la investigación genética y el uso de sus productos en la atención clínica. Su actual foco de investigación es el examen transdisciplinario de la privacidad genética, analizando leyes relacionadas con la genómica y diseñando recomendaciones para políticas públicas futuras sobre el tema, además de examinar el impacto de los resultados genómicos no solicitados, tanto en los pacientes como en los médicos. Recientemente fue miembro del Comité Internacional de Edición de Genes Humanos, Ciencia, Ética y Gobernabilidad, convocada por la Academia Nacional de Ciencias, Ingeniería y Medicina, la Academia China de Ciencias y la Royal Society del Reino Unido. Con ustedes, la doctora Ellen Wright Clayton.
Gracias. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I am delighted to see the energy in this room as you all attack bio law, and hope to share some thoughts with you. I'm particularly going to address this new book that was put out by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in the United States called Human Gene Editing and Science, Ethics, and Governance. I want to be clear that this book is available to download for free, as are all the books of the National Academies. And I have put the email address up there, but if you go to nap.edu, you can find any of our books. But I want to talk about the implications of this particular report for disabilities. My outline and the conclusions that I'm going to reach are these. The tensions between genomics and disabilities are not new, nor is the idea of genetic modification. I do want to review this new report because I think it will have a large impact. Its members included not only people from the United States, but also Europe, Asia, and Africa. I also am going to demonstrate that the role of somatic genetic engineering, which is changing the cells in your body once you're already born, is going to be limited, and that in point of fact, the major debate needs to be about germline gene editing. The tensions that I want to talk about are that disability is in part framed by the social context. Whether you are disabled or not depends a little bit on what your social context is. If you are deaf and live in a community of the deaf, it may not be particularly disabling, but if you live in a community of those who hear, it can be an impediment. We also have to acknowledge that there is a history of abuse in all of our cultures around disability, but there is also, and I want to rely on this, a history of efforts of inclusion about lowering barriers to individuals with disability that we also need to take into account, and that frankly, I think is a ground for some optimism going forward. We also need to talk about disability in the medical setting, defining both the appropriateness of medical intervention, should you do something to alter a condition that's perceived to be disabling, and also recognizing that we do a fair amount to avoid the birth of children with certain conditions. But I also want to be really clear here that most disability is not and never has been the result solely of genetic variation. Most disability is caused by our environment, by our society, by injuries, by many other aspects. And so as we talk about disability and genetics, we need to realize that this fits in a much larger context. I know this, all the slides that have this little box down in the corner are official slides by the National Academies, and I don't change those. But the point of this particular slide is to demonstrate that we're talking about CRISPR, something that has gotten a lot of publicity recently, and that what CRISPR is capable of doing is doing focused single gene or single base pair changes. It's not a new concept. It's been in use for years. But what is different about this is that it is more accessible. It is, quote, easier to use. Anybody who does it will tell you that it's not quite that easy. But it is sort of raising new questions old questions in a new light. Also, the committee came up with a structure for thinking about governance in this area. I'm afraid you can't read all of these, but they talk about fundamental principles as including promoting well-being, transparency, due care, respect for persons, transnational cooperation, fairness, and responsible science. These are things I think you've already heard about this morning, but they suggest that these are the source of from which regulation should come. I would point out something missing here. Human rights is not in this list. Now, in some ways, this is not surprising. Human rights law is not a major discussion in the United States, which was the focus of this project, but I'm going to suggest to you that this is something that will be very important going forward as we work in this domain. And that there are three different major applications of gene editing. I'm not going to talk about research, and I'm going to focus my comments on somatic or changing the cells that you already have versus germline gene editing, which is changing your gametes, your eggs, and your sperm. Again, I want to say that somatic gene modification isn't new. The first time we started talking about this was in 1975 during the Asilomar Conference, when we first started talking about recombinant DNA, in which a group of scientists, just scientists, gathered in Asilomar and decided that there should be a moratorium. One of the things that's remarkable about this is that doing this in 2017 or 2016, we would not even consider thinking about this as being a matter solely for scientists. Stem cell transplants go back at least to the 1980s for single cell disorders. I know this because when I was an intern in pediatrics, we were doing lots of stem cell transplants for severe combined immunodeficiency. This is what you call brute force genetic modification. You take the genes that are there and just replace them all, as opposed to just the one you want. We have a history of doing vector-mediated genetic transfer, where we use something like a virus or something like that to try to get a gene where we want it to go. This also has had some notable examples, the Jesse Gelsinger case in the United States, and germline and X-linked modification for X-linked immunodeficiency in France. And we've even been doing some somatic cell directed at a single gene modification for a while, using a number of other technologies. The difference now is that we have CRISPR, which is more powerful and has fewer areas where you don't get bad inserts. So the committee concluded that somatic therapy is a new tool for gene therapy, but it is a new tool in an old field. And there are two basic ways to think about doing this. One of them is to take your cells out of your body, treat them outside your body, and then put them back in. This is easiest to think about for blood disorders like sickle cell disease or perhaps like leukemias, whereas others you actually have to treat the cells inside your body. This is obviously much more complicated to get it where you want to go, to get it and to make sure that you change that you want. This is generally done in children, but it might be useful in utero. But the point that I want to make here for you all to think about is that it's exciting as somatic cell therapy is, and it is exciting. As part of our committee work, we had a hearing in Paris. I have to say that was pretty nice. And one of the groups that was in the audience was Doctors Without Borders, who are intensely interested in therapies like this to try to get rid of sickle cell disease, which is a major cause of morbidity and mortality throughout equatorial parts of the world. This is the poster child of what we hope to do with gene therapy. But it requires that we be able to do the editing before permanent damage occurs. So therefore, for a disease that has already caused damage in utero, it's too late. We need to be able to get access to the tissues that we need to treat. Blood is a lot easier than treating your brain or your nervous system or your heart, many other things like that. It also is important how much editing is needed. It turns out to make a big, big difference in the life of a person with sickle cell disease. You only have to get 5% of the cells changed. Only 5%. It makes a big difference. It doesn't require that you completely fix this in order to be effective. That's why people are so excited about it. And you also have to look and see how long the editing is going to last. Are you going to get rid of the edited cells pretty quickly, or are they going to hang around? So the fact of the matter is, there are actually, at least at this point, very few things that we can even imagine somatic gene editing for. It's exciting. I hope it works. It would be amazing if we could treat children with sickle cell disease, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. And the other thing to say is that most of the conditions that we worry about, most of the things that disable people medically around the world involve many, many genes, not just one, but many. So heart disease, lung disease, diabetes. Many of these disorders involve many, many genes and require many, many things to fix. So as we think about somatic gene editing, on the one hand, it's attractive. It can actually make a big difference, but its actual availability is relatively narrow. And as a result, the committee concluded that our current regulatory schemes, for instance, in the United States, about how you run clinical trials, about approval by the Food and Drug Administration, about how we control research using IRBs, that those things actually are really pretty much sufficient to regulate in this area. Because if you think about it, this is just doing something we've been doing for 40 years, only doing it better and safer. And the challenge, as is always the case, is going to be when we decide that it's effective enough and safe enough to move into the clinic. Another issue that they discussed, however, and that's a major concern, is that of enhancement. And here, we have to acknowledge that there are some lines that are really hard to draw. The treatment that you might use to treat a young boy with muscular dystrophy might also be helpful for someone who wants to be an athlete. But But in general, and the concerns that are raised about enhancement include, what do we think about parents' attitudes about doing this? What do we think about fairness and about unequal access to these kinds of interventions, which will actually broaden the already extremely broad gaps between those who have and those who have not. But in general, the view of the committee was that at least at present, and at least because somatic gene editing has a fairly narrow scope anyway, that there's not a lot of reason to move forward with enhancement and that we ought to hold back on this. And so that the stance that we ought to take about enhancement at the present is that we should not do this and that we should not use somatic gene editing except to treat things that we clearly think are disease or disability where we can, where it is possible to make a difference, and not other kinds of issues. So that was one of the major points. Where all the debates lie, and where I think they ought to lie, actually, is in the notion of germline gene editing, the idea of changing an embryo, changing sperm, changing eggs, in order to change the characteristics of the child who will ultimately be born. Here as well, this is not new. We've been doing this for a long time. We haven't done it in this way, but we certainly have been doing it. My first article about genetics was in 1978 about using prenatal diagnosis for avoiding the birth of children with certain disorders. We've been using this using tools like amniocentesis, like maternal serum screening, ultrasound, and increasingly in the United States, what's called non-invasive prenatal screening, which is available to look for certain chromosome disorders like Down syndrome and others. The concern, obviously, with a test like this is, in no small part, that it routinizes it. That at least when you've had an amniocentesis or a CVS or an ultrasound, you know you're having it and why you're having it. This is just, quote, another blood test. We've also been looking at the other ways we've done this is carrier screening and testing, both pre and post-pregnancy. Again, a very long history of this in the United States, some with a relatively happy history, others with a less happy history. As particular when we started carrier screening, again, for sickle cell trait in African Americans in a way that turned out to be very harmful to them. Increasingly, we use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis as a part of in vitro fertilization to actually create the embryos and then to see which ones actually don't carry the trait that the couple wants to avoid. And then, of course, one of the newest of these is mitochondrial replacement therapy. Again, there was another report by this from the National Academy Press, which I would urge you to look at. So this has been around for a while. We've been doing this. And there have been objections raised at all stages. In the United States, a lot of this turns around the acceptability of abortion. Not always, but that is central. And some are particularly concerned about choosing to terminate a pregnancy because of a fetal condition. And indeed, in many states in the United States, claims because those tests weren't done are banned by law, either by statute or regulation or case law. There are some also who talk about reproductive genetic testing as sort of a private eugenics, harking back to the policies of the early 20th century in Germany and in the United States, as well as many other parts of the world involving involuntary sterilization. But at the same time, We also see tremendous concerns about unequal access to these technologies, which mean that the rich can make decisions about whether to choose whether to avoid certain diseases in their unborn, but the poor cannot. In fact, the latter is true for almost 50% of pregnancies in the United States. So this is a major, major issue. Again, a major concern about the role of inequality. So the committee talked about heritable genome editing. They concluded that there was progress being made in animals, and that there was a lot of research that was going to be needed. As I've mentioned before, there are a number of ways to think about doing this. It is clearly more effective to alter eggs and sperm than it is to alter embryos. Clearly more effective because of mosaicism or having some cells that were changed and some cells that weren't. But we got here pretty quickly. This is a slide from an article in Science earlier this month, when a team from from Oregon State University has actually modified a human embryo to get rid of a gene that causes a very, very serious heart condition. Now, under our current rules, those embryos must be destroyed after 2 weeks, that they can't be implanted in the uterus of a woman until we know a lot more about downstream effects. But I want to tell you that the ability to do germline gene editing is here. It is possible to do this successfully. Some of the concerns that have been raised about germline gene editing are many, having to do with multi-generational risks, the need for and difficulty of long-term follow-up to see if this works, to see if it has adverse effects, the fact that the children can't give consent, and concerns about movement toward designer babies, concerns about acceptance towards children born with disabilities, and how much intervention there is in nature. My own view about this issue about multi-generational effects, I'm from Houston. And it's pretty doggone clear to me that what we are seeing in Houston today with the hurricane is the result of multi-generational effects of mistakes that have been made over the last 100 years about climate change. So the idea that this is a new thing, that we are doing things to our future generations without asking them, strikes me as something that we do all the time. This is up close and personal to me. So we have to talk about this, but we also have to talk about that this is not new news. But nonetheless, the committee concluded that, that although it is not ready to be used at present, not ready to be used to alter an embryo, be able to implant it into a woman, bring the embryo to term, and then see how things go, is something that we ought to consider. Why ought we to consider it? Because there are lots of people who want to do it, because it would allow people who have known risks of disease to have genetically related children. I think one of the emphases that is really important in both the mitochondrial related disorder discussion and in this discussion is the emphasis that is given about the need to honor people's desires to have genetically related children. I wonder how far we really want to push this, but it was central to this debate. They also suggested that it's important to look at other alternatives than human germline gene editing, but they acknowledged that there might be some cases in which it would be impossible for people to have genetically related children without gene editing. And the example they give are people who are both homozygous for Huntington disease. So I want to emphasize here the tremendous weight that was given to the idea that we ought to allow people to pursue their desire to have genetically related children. Don't get me wrong, I have two who are genetically related to me. I love them, I value them. I just worry sometimes about how far we go. Nonetheless, they concluded that caution is needed, but that caution doesn't mean prohibition, and that there needs to be much, much more research to evaluate existing risk and benefit standards. It's a little hard to know how this is going to proceed without actually doing experiments where you implant modified embryos in people under strict oversight and restricted to a specific set of criteria. So this is what the committee concluded, and that clinical trials are going to include implantation. They have to, because we can't know what the impact on the embryos is going to be. They also noted that, that we don't have nearly enough regulations in this area, that they had to struggle a fair amount to figure out which things the FDA covered, Food and Drug Administration, which things the human subjects regulations apply to. In the United States, they apply only to publicly funded research, not privately funded, and there's no publicly funded research permitted in the United States. So the human research regulations don't apply. They are not, clinical trials aren't permissible here, and that we recognize that in other countries, there are many, many different approaches to regulation, ranging from strict prohibition to some cautious authorization, as we see in the United Kingdom with the HFEA. So this is where the committee, so the key messages of the report, which I'm then going to comment on, are these. Gene editing is, in the context of research in somatic therapy, is valuable and adequately regulated. So I think that is pretty clearly where we are at the moment. They conclude that somatic therapy ought to be used only in the case of disability or disease and for treatment, recognizing that these lines can be hard to draw, but there is not any role for enhancement, and that public engagement and input is needed. That the heritable gene editing needs a lot more research before it can be tried, and that there needs to be a lot more public engagement. This will be extremely difficult in the United States, given the diverse politics of our country at present. And again, that it should be limited only to, only to treating disorders. So here are some of my observations on the report, and then we will have some time for discussion, which I would really love to have. The primary focus of this report, as I reread it in preparation for this talk, is primarily on the benefits and risks to those who would use gene editing. It's primarily for patients who want to treat a disease they already have. It's primarily for parents who want to have children who don't have a disease that runs in the family. And then also on the children whose embryos who would be born after their embryos are treated. And what is interesting to me is that much less attention is paid on the impact on others. And to the extent that, emphasis is paid on this, it is in two contexts. One is in the context of enhancement, making you better than well, making you stronger than you would be. And the concern there is about the notion of unfair advantage. Obviously a major subject of contention in the United States as they try to deal with tremendous and growing inequality in our country. So that's a major focus. The other focus is on inequality to access. The idea that the haves will get this and that the have-nots will not. And so, again, going to the issue of unfair advantage, to the notion of inequality. And relatively little attention is paid to human rights or to the dignity of those with disabilities. Now this, as I look back on it, strikes me as somewhat concerning, and strikes me as an opportunity for those of you who are addressing these issues in your own countries to bring in some of those concerns. However, I'm going to give a more positive note about this in just a minute. So I think a central question that we need to ask as we talk about gene editing, and as we talk about therapeutics in general, whether it be cochlear implants for people who are deaf, whether it be any number of other things, is a central question, is whether it is possible at the same time to honor the dignity of individuals with disabilities when it is increasingly possible to ameliorate or lessen or treat or even cure a very small number of these conditions, or to prevent the birth of children with certain disabilities. I'm going to give you a flash forward here and say that I think the answer is yes. I'll make the argument in just a minute, but I do think that that is the question, and I think that it is not a new question in medicine, but it is raised in a new light. And so we have two questions here, I think, as a legal matter that we can talk about. One is, what deference do we give to individual choice? Do we say that people ought to be allowed to determine the sex of their child? Do we? Because in many cultures, being a female is a disability. It's not even great in the United States. But it's, are you able to choose not to have a child with Down syndrome? Is that a permissible choice? And so those are questions that I think we really need to ask. And then another area that this comes in are, what funding choices are we going to make? What therapies are they going to pay for? As I flew down yesterday on the plane from Nashville, I read that there is a new gene therapy for a type of cancer that they are projecting will cost more than $600,000 for one dose. You know, whether we're going to pay for that as a society or whether we're going to have that be available only to those who are rich enough to pay for it is a major, major issue. And one that I think and one where there is a lot of possibility to talk about legal work. So these are not new questions. They are just raised in a new light. So, and I will argue that the answers to these questions depend to an important degree, not an exclusive degree, on social context and on the legal framework. So, and one of the cases I want to make is this, that as I mentioned to you, I first got involved with this in the 1970s, when it was possible to begin to think about prenatal diagnosis of children with trisomy 21, Down syndrome, and to talk about terminating pregnancies of infants with those disorders. And so I'm going to spell this out in the next two slides. And to say that, you know, there was concern that this was going to lead us to devalue the lives of children with Down syndrome. Shortly after that, not too shortly, but shortly after that, the United States passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. This was passed in 1990 under President George H.W. Bush, and it is the most actual civil rights law passed in the United States since the laws in the 1960s about race and sex discrimination. And there is no question but that the 25 years after its passage, the Americans with Disabilities Act has improved the lives of individuals with disabilities. You will note that the citation I give for this is Fox Business, not an organization that is a big fan of civil rights in the United States. But the fact of the matter is that we have many, many more people with disabilities engaged in the day-to-day life of society than was true when I was a child. When I was a child in my public high school of 2,000 students, we had one student who was blind. We didn't have anybody in wheelchairs. You know, we didn't have anybody with any other sort of disability. And now, in our broader society, we have a lot. We have all kinds of changes in our buildings, changes in our healthcare to meet the needs of individuals with disabilities. And so one of the points that I want to make here is that it may be that one of the places that we look to help us think about how to balance the interests of individuals with disabilities and genetic and gene editing is that we need to look at the larger society, at the society that has the capacity to be more inclusive. Now, it's still the case that individuals with disabilities are still disadvantaged in many ways, but the change from when I was a child is really quite remarkable. And going to the case of Down syndrome, and when at about the time when I was first writing about prenatal diagnosis, it was also the case that children with Down syndrome often did not get surgery for the major surgical problems that they have. They were often put in homes. They didn't get any kind of education or anything of that nature. And they were dramatically discriminated against. In 2017, and I got this quote from our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in which they say that in recent years, children with Down syndrome are becoming more common, despite the fact that many people choose to terminate pregnancies with these infants, and that their lives are becoming healthier and longer. The idea in the United States that you would not operate on a child with Down syndrome who has a heart defect or has a blockage in their esophagus that goes from their mouth to their stomach, or any other thing, would be unthinkable. So the fact of the matter is, at the same time that this is moving, that gene editing, genetic diagnosis is moving forward, what we see is a society that actually cares much more for individuals with disabilities than I would say in any other country in human history. So I think that you can hold these things in your mind at the same time. At the same time, this came from Nature magazine last week. And, you know, I have nothing to say about this. This is a push to use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis in China. And this is a quote. This is a quote from the article that says that is being widely used because genetic diseases carry heavy stigma. People with disabilities get very little support, and religious and ethical pushback against pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is almost non-existent. So this is not good news. But this is in Nature last week. So my conclusions are these: that advances in gene editing shed new light on the tensions between genetics and disabilities. These are not new tensions, but this is new light. And I would argue that the commitment to dignity and to human rights provides an important counter to the more autonomy and beneficence focus of estadounidense bioethics. It's like autonomy is the only thing that matters, it seems like sometimes. But so I think that this is an important counter, to the society I think that we would all want to live in. I do remain optimistic that it is possible to permit the controlled use of these techniques in a society that is respectful of the dignity and rights of those with disabilities. I do think it's possible. I've seen it with my own eyes. I do think it is possible to do it, but I think mindful of our history, mindful of the history of eugenics, of course, in the early 20th century, mindful of the possibilities for abuse, vigilance is required. So I am very much looking forward to your Congress. I expect to learn a lot from you about how to think about these things in ways that we don't typically think about them in los Estados Unidos, and I can't tell you how thrilled and honored I am to be here. Thank you very much.
Pues agradecemos a la doctora Wright su intervención en este tema tan novedoso y que está generando tantos debates, porque sobre todo la manipulación genética que pueda tener una intervención en vía germinal asusta a muchas personas pensando en si esto va a ser un cambio que incida en la especie. Pero por otro lado tenemos también los grandes beneficios, los beneficios para las personas con ciertas discapacidades, y que a lo mejor las respuestas no son tan tajantes de sí o no, sino lo importante es ver cómo se regula, no prohibir, sino permitir bajo ciertas regulaciones, pensando siempre en los beneficios que esto pueda causar. Les van a repartir ahora unas tarjetitas. Oscar, por favor. Las tarjetas para ver quiénes pueden, quiénes quieren presentar alguna pregunta. Aquí rápidamente, van a ser orales, pero bueno, van a ser escritas, pero en lo que recogen los demás temas, si quiere el doctor Valdés hacer alguna intervención.
Sí, gracias. Muchas gracias. Voy a preguntarle qué opina de usar el diagnóstico genético preimplantacional para seleccionar, crear o elegir niños con discapacidades. Esa va a ser mi pregunta. Thank you very much for your talk. It's really interesting. I think it's very related to my own research, I think. So there's a principle, so procreative beneficence. I don't know if you know it. So,
sure.
So I think it was coined by Julian Savulescu, and that principle says that we should have not only the moral obligation, but also, and very especially, the legal obligation of selecting or choosing or creating somehow the best child possible. So
John Harris,
yes.
Yeah.
What do you think about using the preimplantation, the genetic diagnosis for selecting, choosing, or somehow creating deaf, dwarf, or blind children?
So I think this is a really interesting question, and I think it actually reflects in some ways, as a legal matter, this is actually a really complicated question. Because on the one hand, we talk about parents working in the best interest of their child. On the other hand, what they are required to do is avoid inflicting serious harm on their child. En las reglas de abuso y neglect y de todo. Y por eso, tell me if I get off base here. Por eso, creo que la última pregunta es que creación de un bebé que no puede oír, o que no puede ver, o que muy pequeño. ¿Y es esto abuso o es con la poder de los padres? Porque Joel Feinberg y la regla de la futura libre, pero es el trabajo de los padres para to shape their children's futures. Un poco, pero es la obligación de los padres dar las éticas, dar las maneras, dar las educación. Todo eso es la obligación. Y por eso creo que I don't like making blind or deaf children. Pero, at least en los Estados Unidos, con la libertad de los padres, creo que es un argumento que es posible que los padres pueden hacer un bebé que no puede huir. En la situación de vivir en la comunidad de las personas que no pueden huir, es una pregunta close. Es una pregunta close. Pero creo que no es una obligación para los padres hacer un niño perfecto. No es posible y no es la obligación también. Was that responsive to your question?
Absolutely, yes. Thanks so much.
It was a very difficult question. ¿Tenemos algunas preguntas ya? Desafortunadamente tenemos el tiempo limitado, así que daremos respuesta a las preguntas hasta las 10:40.
Oh, great. Dos preguntas. Yeah, no, they're both in English. Is there a dialogue between or debate between the scientific sector and people with disability, NGOs or human rights organizations? Un poco. Por eso, en los Estados Unidos tenemos un proyecto que se llama la Iniciativa de Medicina Precisión, como todo el mundo, pero en los Estados Unidos, y va a estudiar 1 millón de personas con muchas cosas de genética, de su ambiente, de sus actividades de medicinas y de todos. Los líderes de este proyecto incluyen a personas que de derechos de personas con enfermedades genéticas. Creo que es una, ¿cómo se dice lopsided? Estas personas, por la gran mayoría, estoy muy interesante en obtener terapias genéticas. La gran mayoría. Y les con las personas que tienen preguntas sobre la wisdom de
Sabiduría.
Okay. De uso de estas tecnologías. Y ahora, y por eso yo creo que el debate en los Estados Unidos, la atención de derechos humanos no es suficiente. No es bastante que de los abogados que quiere terapias. Okay. And then,
the last one.
yes. What is my opinion about the recent notification of the FDA to the researcher of mitochondrial transfer procedure mentioned that he is no longer allowed to practice mitochondrial procedures in the United States? Es el resultado de la política de los Estados Unidos y el Congreso que no quiere usar ningún embrión, y porque el proceso de mitochondrial transfer requiere 2 embriones, y uno que se fue y uno que obtiene la mitocondria del otro, es solamente el producto de las políticas conservativas de nuestro Congreso y de nuestro Congreso. Y increíble de Trump, pero es la razón. Es una lástima para mí, pero es la realidad ahora.
Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias además a Ellen de su brillante exposición, de hacer el esfuerzo por hablar en español, se lo agradecemos mucho. Y bueno, damos por concluida esta sesión, pero no sin antes, me encargó el doctor Eric Valdés que haga yo la entrega a Ellen de un certificado a Ellen como miembro honorario de nuestra Red Internacional de Bioética y el agradecimiento.